Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now we have quite the episode today, very jam-packed. Just a lot of, surprisingly enough, Latin American news. We don't really cover that much on the show. Granted, a lot of it is more just laughable than anything serious. But again, a lot of the stuff in the UN and Merkel, that is where a lot of our focus is going to be. And a lot of news just came as a flurry out of Korea that I was not expecting. All good, of course, but nonetheless, let's get right into it. So on Sunday, Jair Bolsonaro defeated Fernando Haddad with 55% of the vote. The assassination attempt in September solidified my belief that Bolsonaro would win the election in the second round. I never expected him to win the first round, but I had a feeling he was going to pull it out eventually. Now, after finding themselves the very real possibility of Bolsonaro, the media has now upped their attacks post-election with headlines such as, and I quote, fascism has arrived in Brazil, and Bolsonaro involved. Now, Bolsonaro elected with the expectation of being a heavy-handed leader who was going to crack some skulls. So I will give them that, but granted, they're just like trying to blow this way out of proportion.
Yeah, it's Bolsonaro represents tan fascism, beach fascism.
Fascism. Fascism by day, Rio by night. That's the way you got to live.
Sir fascism. This can go on for a while.
Yeah, we could fill up half an episode if even with that. But a few voices on our side, I do have to address some criticism. Bolsonaro have criticized him mainly on the subjects of neoliberal and Zionism. Now, to the point on neoliberalism, if he wanted to take Brazil down the neoliberal path, he wouldn't have such inflammatory rhetoric against China. He would be more open to China's investments if he was really trying to go down that path. Now, on the Zionism point, they have a bit more credibility with their claims, but Bolsonaro's first foreign visit will be with Netanyahu. He wants embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Now, if I have to say why he's doing this, it's most likely to ingratiate himself to the U.S. Granted, Zionism also isn't as influential in Brazil as it is in the West, so I'm less concerned about it there.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as him anticipating where things are going. That is, you can see that America is tightening up their Monroe Doctrine for this hemisphere. Number two, he sees, I think, also in American Jewish power and world Jewish power, a definite split developing between left and right Jews, and the right Jews are on Trump's team. There's not many, but they are there, and I think that's the reason for the alignment. I think he's being exceptionally pragmatic. Of course, I'm not happy about it, but that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, you have to kiss some rings no matter who you are, and unfortunately, that's the one that is there. But like I said, considering the fact that Brazil doesn't have as much as the lobby as we do in the U.S., I'm less concerned about the point where we use these two foreign heads of state meeting instead of one with dirt over the other, as you may feel whenever a U.S. president meets with an Israeli leader. But on that point, speaking of Zionists, National Security Advisor John Bolton also praised Bolsonaro as a quote-unquote like-minded partner. Now, this either means Bolsonaro isn't everything we expected or coming around. Hopefully the latter, and I'm starting to think, yeah, it is the latter, where Bolton is just kind of like, okay, I'll do what you say. Because fundamentally, I've expressed this before, but I think Bolton is something of a junkyard dog for the Trump administration, or the bad cop fuel. Someone you can put out there if you want to scare someone, and someone who will be belligerent that will make you look good in comparison, you as in Donald Trump.
Yeah. It's a transition period, as we've said many times before. And the truth is, no one knows what this administration is going to do. There is, however, an inherent contradiction, and it does involve the split between its domestic policy and its international policy. They don't make sense. you can't be the boss of the world and not give a little honey. And so honey is being withtracted, and but everything on the domestic front probably will ensure that Trump will get, of course, reelected, and that the midterms will go to the Republicans.
Yeah, if I had to describe Trump's foreign policy, just as you put it, I would describe it as a tug of war. And I think that's really the only way you can put it.
Yeah.
But speaking of Trump's foreign policy and John Bolton, for that matter, John Bolton used the opportunity of Bolsonaro's victory to tackle his quote-unquote troika of tyranny in Latin America. And get this, guess I will give you all 30 seconds to guess what the troika of tyranny is.
You're asking me?
Starting now.
Oh,
no, I'm giving our audience 30 seconds to guess. 25 now. 20. 10. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, the troika of tyranny is Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Three defunct Latin American states that are all stuck in the 50s. They are the greatest threat within the American hemisphere.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the 80s Cold War. I mean, America's problem with these states is that they have good relations with Russia. In fact, it was either today or yesterday. The president of Cuba visited Moscow, but Putin didn't meet him. Actually, just some of his ministers.
Yeah, I figured it was one of those kind of meetings where you meet with the high-ranking officials because the president of Russia is doing important things. He has no time for the president of Cuba. And one interesting thing I do have to say about Cuba is we're really squandering opportunity here, considering the fact Castro is still technically within a ceremonial position of power, but the guy actually running Cuba, he's a younger guy, and we could really court him and bring him over. For example, we missed this opportunity when Castro first took power because Castro, at the end, was just an opportunist. He fought against quote-unquote U.S. imperialism, but he could have the U.S. could have reached out to him and turned him into our guy if we wanted to. That was a missed opportunity, and I feel like we're missing that opportunity again. Now, to continue on with what Bolton said in particular, he said, and I quote, "The recent elections of like-minded leaders in key countries, including Ivan Duque in Colombia, and last weekend, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, are positive signs for the future of the region and demonstrate a growing regional commitment to free market principles, open, transparent, and accountable government." Now, a lot of that, it's just a lot of that neoliberal stuff, like, the free market and the... I would go on to say, he continued with, quote, "Under this administration, we will no longer appease dictators and despots near our own shore in this hemisphere. We will not reward firing squads, torturers, and murderers. The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, have finally met its match." This speech was also accompanied with the announcement of new sanctions on Venezuela. Now, in regards to what he said, I could honestly take it or leave it. It was more laughable than anything, if you couldn't tell by the way we're treating it on this show right now. I personally think it's the wrong strategy, and I could not care less about dictators or what they do in their own country, so long as it's not like absolutely egregious to the point where it's like a blotch in the world, like something you'd think like a North Korea or a Saudi Arabia. But if anything, we should, as I said earlier, we should be courting these countries, especially Cuba and Venezuela, to counteract the Chinese. Because I know more so in Venezuela, the Chinese have bailed them out. Begrudgingly so, but there's still some amount of Chinese influence there. And the U.S. should also make it clear that we don't care about ideology or domestic policy, and that we just want to make a deal and do some business. And I will say this: destabilization of these countries is dangerous. This would make the caravan that is currently heading toward the border look like an joke.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. There's only so much you can use countries like Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela as a boogeyman in order to bolster either their military-industrial complex or just a general fear. It has a limited shelf life, and no one believes any of these countries are a threat. Of course, Bolton isn't saying necessarily that they're a threat, but what he's saying is there's an obligation that the United States has to introduce, I suppose, democracy or America's idea of a more fair democracy, but the track record for the last 25 years has been really bad. So I don't think people believe them on that front either. But I agree with you. It's a lost opportunity. I honestly think like keeping some of these states as boogeymen worked in the 80s. And that was during the time of the Soviet Union, and there really hasn't been any kind of creative thinking about these other states. In terms of how to woo them over, because primarily there's a conflict within American elites in government as to, how many migrants do they want every year? How diverse do they want America to be? How lucrative is that? So there's definitely a tug of war about what America's policies should be, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes, because there's no way you can separate, especially with Nicaragua's case, the migrant crisis, from Central America and America, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think the best policy is I have no issue with meddling their politics. I know this is actually an area I'm a bit more hawkish on, but I have no problem in doing that in the interest of the Monroe Doctrine. But I also think we should try to give them the carrot before we give them the stick. But we also really have to consider, alternatively, we could just be prodding Brazil and Colombia to solve problems within their own region rather than relying on the U.S., which would honestly be more the America First take, saying, take care of what's going on in your backyard. We're willing to help you, but we're not going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes eminently more sense.
Yeah, and just to also put this entirely in context, it's also important to keep in mind that this speech was given less than a week before the midterm elections at the Freedom Tower in Miami, which served as the processing center for Cuban refugees in the 1960s. And also keep in mind that Cuban diaspora are a major Republican voting bloc in the swing state of Florida. So I'm thinking a lot of it is probably related to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bang on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who were talking about this really overlooked that fact. And speaking, just while we're in the confines of Latin America, Trump has finally deployed troops to the border with estimates that it will be around 15,000 troops. Now, this is 3 times more than what we originally expected. Now, compare that to the 2,000 we officially have in Syria, the 6,000 we officially have in Iraq, and the 9,800 we officially have in Afghanistan. Now, needless to say, I support them being in the deserts of the southwestern United States than I do in the deserts of the Middle East. Granted, not those areas. Now, the caravan is roughly the same size troops deployed. Now, despite my support for this move, patrolling the border with our actual, big guns, this has the potential to become a PR nightmare, and I'm fully willing to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I don't think this is really going to, for the people who are going to vote for, like, ostensibly for Trump in so much as they vote for Republicans, I don't think they're concerned. I think that the country is already it's already very, very divided on these issues, and this was, this reckoning day was coming anyways. And yeah, I don't think it's not going to hurt him. It's not going to hurt him. It's not going to hurt him any more than Kavanaugh.
Oh, absolutely not. But just a quick thing. You are roboting a little, just to give you a heads up on that. And number 2, in relation to the caravan, as far as I know, I think it's actually supposed to arrive like a couple days after the midterms, which means this will probably become a completely insignificant issue if that's the case. Now, if I'm wrong, it'll be a much bigger issue. But as far as I know, it's supposed to arrive like a few days to a week afterwards. So I doubt the American public will care about too much whether they be Democratic or Republican, because the election will be over and just how these things work in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Soros didn't rent the fastest trucks. I don't know what to say. It doesn't seem planned very well.
Yeah, certain military surplus from certain countries apparently didn't get the job done. Better luck next time. That's all I have to say.
You tried.
Yeah. I mean, you get a silver star for that one. You can't get the gold star, but you get the silver star. But
yeah.
Speaking of migrants, we can talk about the UN Migration Pact, which has made waves as of recently. Some pretty good news about that. Now, country after country have decided to withdraw from the UN Migration Pact following Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. back in, I believe it was early October. Now, the U.S. was followed by Austria and then Hungary, of course. Now, as of today, Croatians have announced that they will be following suit. And we will likely see the Czech Republic and Poland leave, as well as possibly Italy. And I think if Italy leaves, another major country aside from the United States pulling out will encourage other major countries. And I see the pact falling apart if this trend continues, which I am absolutely not opposed to. I'm honestly not sure what the Russians are going to do because in terms of migration issue, it's not like they're really on the forefront of receiving migrants and refugees. The Chinese, they'll probably support it just to screw over the West. But again, I see a lot more Western countries backing out. I mean, who knows what Macron will do? Macron could come out and support it one day, and then the day it's supposed to go into effect, he could say, I'm out of this.
Yeah, he's acting very bizarre lately. Macron.
Yeah.
And
he has been all over the place ever since he's gotten elected. But yeah, especially lately, he has been on the, like, what are you doing side.
Yeah, I think he's preparing to take over the EU after Merkel. I'm joking.
Oh yeah. In his dreams, I think he had to be at least 5'10" on an international organization.
Yeah,
but yeah, just in a couple inches short. But as Chad points out, he does have a 29-point approval rating. So just based on French public opinion, he could try to use this as a publicity stunt to pull out of the pact and say it's what the people wanted, so he doesn't have to bear as much blame for it. Yeah, because like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually got out of it. And I'm starting to bank more towards it. People may call me crazy. Feel free to call me crazy. But in terms of other countries that back out, probably Brazil now, considering the recent elections. But I can't think of any other major countries that would really take a stand on this. I mean, of course, like I said, Czech Republic and Poland will be following suit. But I would expect other Eastern European countries, maybe along the lines of Romania or Bulgaria, possibly Greece even.
Yeah, I would definitely think Bulgaria will do it. It's not the favorite route, but it is one of the it is one of the routes that they're using.
And who I just thought of that might be another wild card in this?
Who?
Who knows what Erdogan will do in this situation?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily see him pulling out, but again, it's also in his character to do the thing that Macron does and pull those moves out of nowhere where you wouldn't expect them.
Yeah, I would think he would use it as a weapon.
Yeah. So
I mean, he's still not in the EU, so
yeah, I imagine there's some way he can work that into his goals, but in terms of most of it, I don't see this pact lasting, especially with the U.S. of all people pulling out and the chain of European countries getting out of it. And yeah, so at least that's been defeated. One piece of globalism has been defeated. One of many heads of this absolute beast, but I'm going to take whatever victory I can get at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a partial victory, but we'll take it.
Yeah. And now for more good news. Progress has continued on the Korean Peninsula. South Korean President Moon Jae-in announced that Kim Jong-un could very possibly be visiting South Korea soon. And this is after several meetings they've had at DMZ safe zones and Moon's visit to Pyongyang, I believe, in September. Now, the U.S. and North Korea have also both agreed to intensify denuclearization talks in the future. And this is after months of stagnation following the summit in June. Rhetoric has also taken a much more positive tone on both sides, with Korean state media even going as far as to call Kim's meeting with Secretary Pompeo in early October, quote-unquote, wonderful and productive. Now, Secretary Pompeo is also meeting with North Korean officials next week to push progress and arrange a second summit. It's likely that there will be a summit as soon as the beginning of next year. Now, despite the warmness, however, Kim has expressed frustrations with the current U.S. sanctions and wants more negotiations on those. So, again, it's back and forth with healthy dialogue, which is the best you could say about Korea. And truth be told, this could be a lot worse And considering the rate it's going at, it could. I say it's going the best possible. On top of this, the demilitarized zone will finally be living up to its name by establishing a no-fly zone within 20 kilometers, as well as a military drill ban within 20 kilometers of the border, coming into effect as of today, 1st of November. Now, this is also being accompanied by the removal of landmines and guard posts along the border on both sides.
Yeah, to me, South Korea has faded in the news, obviously, because things are going quite well. There's an obsession with Khashoggi, and of course, that's bringing up Yemen. But I'm very sure that the media will ignore if there's a resolution in Trump's second term. You can be sure it will get very little play.
Oh, absolutely. They're not going to give him any victory. I mean, outside of a few people on Fox News, in terms of mainstream media, he has no friends. And like I said, the only person I would say reliably is probably Tucker. But on terms of the Korea thing, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, the U.S. isn't doing enough." And as I've said in the past, if Trump was doing the opposite, he would be accused of breathing down their necks and stifling the process, in which that would be justified. But in my opinion, I think the U.S. has done what it needs to, where it facilitates the talks between the two Koreas, where they've been in constant contact ever since the last summit. I believe we still do have some role there, but again, it's not as much as some people say it is. And again, we spurred these talks. We do deserve some credit for them, but at the end of the day, it's the issue of the Korean people, and it's their fate to decide because they actually live there. Yet, I still support international observation, international participation in helping hammer out these talks. And the U.S. has been remarkable in terms of what I could have ever expected, even under Trump.
Yeah, I echo those points. He's handled this very well. I remember a few months back where one of them, well, not a few months back, it was actually during the UN speech that North Korea gave at the UN. They said there's no denuclearization without trust. If we don't form a trust with the US, the nukes are staying. And to that end, it seems that the trust is forming.
I definitely agree, and I think it was probably that probably defrosted, for lack of a better term, these talks that kind of stalled out after the beginning of the summer in Singapore. But I'm still convinced that South Korea does not care as much about the nukes, considering the fact that they're not putting it at sale anymore. But I think they like it in terms of partnership with North Korea. I think they like the idea of being a nuclear state. Now, I have no evidence to back this up. This is just a hunch, a speculation.
Well, I mean, I think any state really would want to have nuclear armaments for positioning, for safety, for assertion, geopolitically speaking. So that North Korea denuclearizing, of course, would have to mean it's on the pathway of reunification with South Korea. It can only mean that. That would be the only reason why it would be tantalizing to denuclearize, given the amount of isolation that they've had. So, yeah, go ahead.
Also, upon a few was recently that Kim Jong Un is willing to let U.S. inspectors into some sites, but I think this goes back to what they were saying during the UN meeting, where there has to be a trust before there's denuclearization. They're not going to let sites. It's going to be a gradual thing. You can expect after that, you can expect here, here, and here. Trump is a failure. The gradual process is going along much faster than any. Point out
Sorry,
by the chat. North
you're breaking
Korea
out.
does need to keep McDonald's out. That is the one thing they do have to avoid the gold. Again, Now, hold on.
Sorry, fellas, but you know what? It's halftime, so we always have to deal with the breakup. But Constantine will be back, and let me know if I know I've been breaking up as well. That's true, Ricky. Keep Global Homo out. But I doubt it's going to happen. I think if they reunify, North Korea will be filled with McDonald's and whatnot.
Technical difficulties. Now, what it? Hey, no, the one thing I do have to say is McDonald's stays out things should and that is the one that North Korea is going to get this deal limit. They may just be some adverse, but I maybe it's not such bad.
Sorry, I didn't. I couldn't hear that.
Okay, I apologize for that. The weather is a bit bad here on top of my already poor internet, so tonight isn't necessarily the best combination. But I do want to get into some stuff with Saudi Arabia because there's been quite a few developments there that I have found pretty interesting. Now, after the Khashoggi debacle, almost the entire world has turned against Saudi Arabia in some point or another. Now, the U.S. was a bit of an outlier, drawing criticism towards Trump, despite there eventually being a U.S. response. Now, despite Trump's less than average response to this issue and less aggressive take, either by choice or by circumstance, which I lean probably towards the latter, is probably more by circumstance. He couldn't necessarily slap an embargo on Saudi Arabia, if you know what I'm saying. There has still been significant outrage amongst the U.S. political class to the point where five Republican senators, Marco Rubio, Todd C. Young, Cory Gardner, Rand Paul, and Dean Heller, sent a letter to the president imploring him to end nuclear energy talks with Saudi Arabia. They also threatened to introduce legislation to block civil nuclear cooperations with Saudi Arabia. Now, this letter also called into question Saudi Arabia's action in Yemen. And in the most surprising move, the most surprising part of this letter towards the end, the senators also said it would be hypocritical and dangerous to accept anything less of Saudi Arabia that we did not demand of the Iranians.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and coming from neocons like Marco Rubio, too.
Yeah, I almost think this is a capitulation of the war in Iran. I mean, sorry, the war in Yemen. It was supposed to be over. And I think many people thought that Saudi Arabia would clean up after it had joined in, like about 2 years ago, a little bit before Trump's election. And here we are, 2 years later, and it's still going. So I kind of see this as a capitulation. They want some kind of deal. Several American-made ships have been sunk with basically just Zodiac dinghies and missiles. So I'm seeing a tie-in basically with Yemen, and in fact, even France 24 and some of the other sort of neo-lib news was as much saying the same thing.
Yeah, and I also have a feeling that last part sounds like something straight out of Rand Paul's mouth. So I imagine certain parts of the letter were influenced by certain authors of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like I said, I don't necessarily see Marco Rubio saying something like that, but I could definitely see Rand Paul saying something like that. Now, Again, that was a phenomenal letter. I'll actually try to link the full text after this done because I can't edit the description right now. If you want to read it for yourself, because it's pretty surprising, something I would not have expected even 6 months ago, or even when the Khashoggi scandal first began. Now, the U.S. and UK are also seeking a ceasefire in Yemen. The calls from Secretary of Defense James Mattis came from over the weekend and were followed up by both Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. Now, Pompeo said it was, quote, time to end the conflict, replace conflict with compromise, and allow many people to heal through peace and reconstruction. Pompeo also called for the end of Houthi missile attacks against Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as ending coalition airstrikes in heavily populated areas. Now, Mattis came out and said, quote, we need to be doing this in the next 30 days. Now, my main contention with this is, I'm not surprised by this, is end all missile strikes in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but only end Saudi airstrikes and coalition airstrikes in quote-unquote heavily populated areas. So, of course, there's going to be a bit of that skewing, but again, considering the fact that I would have never seen this even like a month ago, I still can't complain too much. Now, despite the fact that a ceasefire is still unlikely to come, this still shows the U.S. drifting away from Saudi Arabia, which I cannot complain about at all.
Yeah, agreed. Ultimately, it's a better image. In a way, Trump needs an image, globally. Given how the rest of the Western world media will depict the southern migrant crisis that's looming in November, he needs something positive, and he needs something. Because right now, basically, the libs are saying, well, Trump's got too many financial ties with Saudi Arabia, as if America doesn't, like as if this hasn't been the case since the 30s. I mean, America built its first military bases in Saudi Arabia in 1951. So, there's only so much you can do when the country that is to a great extent is propping up your dollar while you're in trillions in debt, that you're going to just force them to play a hand.
Yeah, I like anything outright of complete destruction of the Arabian Peninsula, which again would be a disaster in and of itself. Nothing beyond that is going to break Saudi influence. I'm not even, arguing for that. I think, especially as time goes on, it will gradually decrease. But the funniest thing, if you can call any of this funny, is how just Iran plays into this, and how just Iran, by virtue of existing, has won this mini Cold War with Saudi Arabia because they couldn't properly conduct an assassination.
I know, it's incredible.
Because, of course, the U.S. isn't going to let up on Iran anytime soon. Now, that being said, I don't expect what some of the more black pillars say in terms of conflict with Iran. Granted, I don't completely rule it out, but at this point, I don't see it as that high of a possibility. I'd give it like a 30-35% chance. Maybe that's a bit low, a bit high, but that's just me personally. But I think it's funny because, in terms of containing Iran, which is one of the things Trump said to defend Saudi Arabia during the Khashoggi thing before immediately going back on that and taking a million different positions on that, which it's Trump, and that's kind of his thing to do in these kinds of situations. It's also going to look very bad just to the American public in general, cooperating with Saudi Arabia on anything at this point, and even to the point where, like I said, neocon Republican senators are willing to forego cooperation with Saudi Arabia, even though it would mean sticking it to the Iranians. I mean, like I said, I am just so shocked that someone like Marco Rubio could come out and say that. But like I said, there was 5 of them collectively. I know Rand Paul is definitely more the non-interventionist side. I think a couple of the other ones were on more of that non-interventionist side. I think Rubio was actually the outlier there. But the point is, where you can convince someone like him to come around to, I guess, quote-unquote, our side, at least on some issues, that things are changing, and they're changing fast. And more or less, they're changing for the better.
Yeah, again, it's this out of nowhere, and Khashoggi continues to deliver. There's even countries that you can even see on press TV the way Iran is looking at this. Of course, Iran is in a tight spot, so it tends to demonize America quite a bit, often deservedly so. But they're also on the side of like we have to do something about this Khashoggi thing that's happening, and I honestly think there isn't going to be that much. Like, what to what extent and what Trump does will have to be nuanced, but he will do something. I do think he will punish Saudi Arabia in one way or another.
Yeah, and you know,
And I think intervening in Yemen is that. I think
yeah,
now you could argue and say that this is all so convenient. The war wasn't going well anyways. Yeah, perhaps that is the case. But it will the war on Yemen is also a spot on Saudi Arabia as well.
yeah, and going back to Iran, they've played this very wisely. They haven't done much in Iraq or Syria. They've really tempered themselves on that. They haven't done much in relation to Yemen to the point where they've really constrained themselves and let Saudi Arabia destroy itself in a way to the point where they're going to benefit. And I know this may be a bit of a long shot considering all the factors at play, but we could see more reconciliatory rhetoric towards the Iranians, which we almost had at the UN summit. We almost had a meeting between Trump and Rouhani in order to punish the Saudis. But like I said, it's a long shot. But again, out of all the things that would happen, nothing could surprise me at this point.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. But you want to finish off with the big story here?
Yes,
No,
Merkel.
this,
So
you, go,
this is fascinating. So Merkel has resigned, and
no, she's
she.
going to resign.
What? Sorry.
She announced she's going to not seek re-election
That's
and
yes, yes. So
yeah,
I was being overly optimistic.
yeah. Don't get our audience hopes up, okay? Look, we
Yeah,
can have some white pilling, but not too much.
yeah. So Merkel has announced that she's not running for re-election and will step down in 2021. This follows after a very poor showing in the recent elections in Germany, primarily with an area in Bavaria and Hesse. So Merkel's government is in a coalition with the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, and both of them lost 11%. And I think they see the writing on the wall that it's no longer she's no longer tenable. Her era has passed. In fact, there's been ministers in German government who have said this. Um, Now, one of the things that this shows is that the AFD actually has far more power, whether they're elected or not, in that they're able to draw power away and reveal the weakness of the coalition. The SDP, in fact, has been so shocked by this, they're considering breaking off. At the moment, they're very weak and will probably suffer if they do. But should one more, let's say, one more terrorist attack or more migrants flood in, we're going to see an election.
No, yeah,
That
they will force
that
that.
is for sure. Now, Merkel has been trying to groom who is going to replace her. Merz, Brinhaus, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing these correctly, and Schaupin. Now, Schaupin has been very critical of her migration policy, her open borders policy, and it's not that she wouldn't want him in. And there's another gentleman by the name of Krautenbauer, who I think might be taking over. Um, However, her own party has gone against it.
Oh,
So
yeah.
even internally, there is there is a civil war going on, if you will, for lack of a better term.
And just to put it into perspective for our audience, for the time Merkel has been chancellor since 2006, in the same time, there's been 2 Russian presidents, 2 Chinese presidents, 3 U.S. presidents, 4 UK prime ministers, 4 French presidents, and 6 Japanese prime ministers.
Yeah, only I think she just edged out Margaret Thatcher as the longest ruler of a party in democratic history. I think
Yeah,
18 years.
I think that's accurate. And like I said, her party, as we were discussing, along with the Social Democrats, have been facing many issues, such that election Bavaria. Now, one thing we do have to consider, as you hinted at, due to the nature of parliamentary democracy, Merkel may be out sooner than 2021, for example. After Brexit, I know that was a much more major event and like a much major shift. But Cameron said he would step down by October, even though the vote was in June. He stepped down 2 days later. So we could see Merkel stepping down within the time of over the next year. Now, another factor we also have to consider is that the CDU, Merkel's party, is technically a center-right party, despite the fact that they coalesced with the Social Democratic Party. Now, depending on who the next leader of their party is, it may take a more conservative direction and ally with a more right-wing party such as the AfD, and take Germany down a similar path to how Kurz, who is also part of the center-right party, the current chancellor of Austria, and it may go in that direction similar to Austria. So that's something else we have to consider in all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, her government is very weak right now, and I expect that it will continue to get weaker within the next year. Hopefully, there'll be more divisions in her party. Remember, there are ministers in the CDU who asked for her to step down. So I think they see the writing on the wall. I think they're afraid of losing political power, and they're preparing for a new direction.
And
because they're not going to sell a new narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way they can salvage this, and they have to completely start over. And like I said, they'll probably go back to their roots as a center-right party and try to work with more right-wing parties. But it's quite interesting because we had in 2015, 2014, 2015, the spread of anti-neoliberalism, whether it took the form of like almost literal communism in Greece or right-wing populism in Hungary. We had that spread in Europe and the poor countries in Europe in 2015. 2016, we got Brexit and Trump. 2017, despite Le Pen not winning, she still had an impressive showing in the French elections, and so did her Front National party there, at the point where they became, I believe, the main opposition in the French government. And then we saw throughout the success in 2018, of course, the Italian election, Orban's overwhelming re-election, the Swedish election, where the Swedish Democrats overperformed what a lot of people expected them to. And finally, despite the fact that there was a German election in 2018 that Merkel barely eked out, it's the anti-neoliberal revolution, I guess you could call it, has finally made its way to Germany's doorstep. Which I'm surprised it happened this quickly. I figured they would have been one of the very last holdouts.
Yeah, it is changing. I think for a lot of people, maybe they feel it's not changing fast enough, but it was never going to change quickly. I think that's a realistic thing to say. I think very hard days are ahead. It's only going to get harder, but I don't think this is not a fad. This is not something that's just going to pass away. And there is no, how can I put it? In many ways, compared to the 30s or to other eras where there was a lot of nationalism, at the moment, there isn't a war that would address that. A war between, let's say, America and Russia that would be fomented by more Israeli interference in Syria isn't going to resolve the ideological differences that the West faces right now. Whereas in the 30s, the wars, you could argue, of course, there was an economic geopolitical angle to it, of course. But the convenient narrative, the political narrative, was also very robust and could be relied upon. Now, not so much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Again, and just going back to the wars, think about the previous wars we've tried to fight or either initiate. Syria was human rights and chemical weapons, and taking down the Iranian regime is like human rights and terrorism. Taking down Iraq was we need to get rid of Saddam's WMDs. Afghanistan, terrorism. The Gulf War, Saddam is a rogue state. But yeah, like you said, there hasn't really been ideological war. It's just been these really I guess you call them world police kind of wars. And it's funny because what you say is like, for example, the U.S. and Russia would go toe to toe. It wouldn't solve that, and I agree with that. And I think a lot of what has stifled that, of course, I don't want a war, but I think a lot of what has stifled at least confrontation in Europe, whether it be violent or nonviolent, is the European Union. I think that just goes to show how detrimental it is to Europe as to Western civilization as a whole, considering the fact, again, our strength has been built on competition. I believe I've iterated this before, that the European Union is completely antithetical to what made Europe Europe. European powers became so powerful and dominated the world because they were competing against each other, not because they were cooperating with each other.
Right, right. Or at least they would have periods of competition, cooperation, back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, of course, there was cooperation between multiple states against other multiple states. So, and those alliances were constantly in flux depending on what the issue of the day was. And I think,
Absolutely.
despite the fact that it was technically more violent, the wars were slower burning and they were less action packed than some of the wars we've had in more recent history. And I think fundamentally that was beneficial, considering the fact it was always, us versus them. Who's going to be better at this? And I think, again, this is an example I usually go back to. We, as human beings, went to space and landed on the moon in one of the most tense periods in human history, one of the most tense periods of competition in human history between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think that really attests to the power of competition as opposed to cooperation. And I think, I don't mean to sound condescending, but I think any sane person, especially Europeans, should be able to see that.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I mean, show me another peninsula on any continent that has, as you know, over 28 countries. This is literally over 28 countries. It wasn't always that way. That's true, but it was at least 10 all the time. And
Yeah,
Europe is not
usually
that
more.
big. Let's say you only include a part of Russia. Like definite, even further toward Europe than the Ural Mountains. You're not really talking about a huge geographic space. It would still be smaller than America.
Yeah, and look, for contrast, the Asian civilizations, China, Japan, have been very successful in their own right, but especially in the case of China, there hasn't been that much competition. Do you wonder why Taiwan was virtually unpopulated until Portuguese sailors arrived there and moved Chinese there? Because they had nobody to compete with. They had no ambition to expand. Realistically, after the fall of the Mongols, China dominated their entire area. It's not like Japan was going to mount an entire naval invasion. Of course, that happened during World War II, but of course, the technology was more lending to that, and it was more realistic at that point. But especially just back centuries ago, China pretty much stood untouched beyond Russian expansion settlement in the Far East. So I would say, despite China having a lot of elements from successful civilization, they had nobody to compete with and nobody to get one over. So a lot of that potential was squandered, as opposed to the Europeans.
Yeah, I think it's a very good analysis. It's a very good general take.
Yeah, like I said, I think that fundamentally, I think that little rant, that little tangent I went down there, is one of my biggest issues with globalism and neoliberalism. It defangs. I mean, you may point at the numbers, point at the GDP, point out whatever you will, and say, look how much more prosperous we are. But again, look at the rate of innovation. Look at all the technology that came out of the 20th century, Cold War. It was phenomenal. Imagine if we had a second Cold War with China, all the technology that would come out of that. And that's my point. I think it may give you short-term gains, but neoliberal and globalism will stifle progress in the end because it will stifle competition. And I say that's my final word for the day.
Very good. Hear, hear.
So thank you all for tuning in to the War Report. I, of course, will be with the regular content. We'll be with the show next week after the midterm. So we'll see how Trump's treaty-making powers will be affected. So that'll be interesting, definitely. So I will see you guys then, and goodbye.